You wake up on election day with a feeling you've learned to call civic duty. You stand in line. You make your selection. You press the button or mark the paper. And as you leave the polling station, something whispers that you've participated in democracy, that you've done your part, that the system, for all its flaws, has absorbed your voice. But here's what nobody wants you to examine too closely. That feeling of participation isn't evidence of democracy. It's evidence of a brilliant substitution. They've replaced the continuous, demanding work of collective self-determination with a ritualized gesture that costs you 90 minutes every few years. And they've convinced you that this substitution is not just adequate, but sacred. Democracy, in its living form, is exhausting. It requires constant attention, perpetual negotiation, the daily friction of encountering difference and working through it. It demands that you remain awake to the mechanisms of power, that you interrupt your private comfort to address collective problems. True democratic participation is so intensive, so all-consuming, that any system genuinely committed to it would need to radically restructure how we organize time, labor, and social life. So they gave you something easier. They gave you voting. And voting, unlike democracy, can be completed. It has a clear beginning and end. It creates the psychological satisfaction of task completion without the inconvenience of actual power. Substitution, nobody consider how we speak about this ritual. We don't say we voted in an election. We say we participated in democracy. The language itself performs the substitution. It takes a specific, limited action and inflates it to encompass an entire political system. This isn't accidental. Language shapes perception, and if the language convinces you that marking a ballot equals democratic participation, then you'll never ask what actual participation might require. The system has discovered something more effective than preventing you from participating. It has made you believe you already are. Your sense of political agency has been satisfied by a mechanism that requires almost nothing from you and gives you almost no real influence over the conditions of your life. Think about the decisions that actually structure your existence. The algorithms that determine what information reaches you. The corporate policies that dictate your working conditions. The financial mechanisms that decide whether you can afford housing, healthcare, education. The technological infrastructure that monitors and monetizes your behavior. How many of these were you asked to vote on? How many could you vote on, even theoretically? But every few years, you're presented with a choice between pre-selected candidates, each operating within parameters you had no role in establishing, proposing policies you cannot modify, funded by interests you cannot see. And this, you're told, is the fullest expression of political freedom available to you. There's a specific relief that comes after voting. You've done it. You can return to your private life with a clear conscience. Whatever happens next isn't your fault, because you participated in the process. This relief is carefully manufactured. The system needs you to feel that your duty is complete, that no further action is required or even appropriate. Wait for the next election, the system whispers. That's when you'll have power again. But power that appears only at scheduled intervals and disappears immediately after is in power. It's permission to feel powerful. And there's a profound difference between those two states, though the system has every interest in preventing you from recognizing it. Consider the emotional architecture of election cycles. The manufactured urgency. The framing of each election as the most important of your lifetime. The fear-based motivation. The insistence that if you don't vote, you're complicit in disaster. This isn't the language of empowerment. It's the language of hostage negotiation. Vote or else. Participate in this specific ritual or accept responsibility for catastrophe. And notice what this framing does. It makes you grateful for the opportunity to vote. It makes you defensive about voting. It makes you police others who question whether voting alone constitutes meaningful political action. You've been deputized to protect the very system that limits you, because any critique of voting feels like a critique of your own political agency. This is the genius of the substitution. It doesn't just replace democracy with voting. It makes you emotionally invested in defending that replacement. It converts your desire for genuine power into loyalty toward a mechanism that provides almost none. Here's the question but you're not supposed to say this out loud. You're supposed to maintain enthusiasm. You're supposed to believe that this time will be different, that this candidate truly represents change, that your vote will finally translate into transformation. The system requires your optimism the way an engine requires fuel. Without it, the entire mechanism grinds to a halt. So you perform optimism. You share the posts. You wear the buttons. You have the conversations. And beneath all of it, you carry the knowledge that you're participating in theater. But theater you're not allowed to call theater because naming it would make you cynical, defeatist, privileged, or worse, someone who's given up on democracy. Notice the trap. The system has made it impossible to critique the insufficiency of voting without being accused of rejecting democracy itself. It's conflated the ritual with the reality so thoroughly that questioning one feels like abandoning the other. This isn't accidental. It's perhaps the most successful ideological achievement of contemporary power, making its own limitation seem like the outer boundary of possibility. The language of elections has borrowed entirely from the language of consumption. Candidates are brands. Voters are consumers. Campaigns are marketing. Policy positions are products. And your vote is the ultimate expression of consumer preference in a marketplace of ideas. This translation seems neutral, even modern, but it smuggles in a complete redefinition of political agency. A consumer chooses between available options. A consumer does not make things. A consumer does not determine what gets produced, how it gets produced, or why. A consumer operates entirely within constraints established elsewhere by people with different roles and different powers. When democracy becomes consumption, you lose the possibility of being anything other than a consumer. You cannot be a maker of the world. You can only select from pre-made worlds, each designed by people you'll never meet, for purposes that may have nothing to do with your actual needs. And like all good consumer systems, electoral democracy has learned to generate loyalty through the illusion of personalization. This candidate speaks to you. This message resonates with your identity. This campaign understands your community. The system fragments you into demographic segments, each receiving targeted messaging, each believing their particular consumption choice is an authentic expression of their values. But step back and look at the architecture. Everyone, regardless of which brand they prefer, is still consuming. Everyone is still operating as an isolated individual making private choices. Everyone is still locked out of the production side of politics. The personalization is real. The participation is not. There's something worth examining in the physical ritual of voting itself. The line, the booth, the privacy, the individual confronting the ballot alone. This isn't just practical necessity. It's ideological infrastructure. Democracy, in any meaningful sense, is collective. It's people gathering, deliberating, arguing, compromising, deciding together. But the voting booth breaks this entirely. It isolates you. It makes your political power a matter of private conscience rather than public engagement. It transforms politics from a shared practice into a personal confession. And this isolation serves a function. When you vote alone, you cannot know how others are voting. You cannot coordinate. You cannot collectively refuse bad options. You cannot build power through solidarity at the moment power is supposedly being exercised. The very design of the voting process prevents collective political action. Then comes the counting. You wait. You watch screens. You see percentages accumulate. You experience the outcome as something happening to you rather than something you're making happen. Even if your candidate wins, the victory feels external. You consumed the right product and the market validated your choice. But you didn't win anything. Someone else won, and you helped. This is what voting does to political agency. It converts it into a form that feels participatory while remaining completely passive. You act, but your action is constrained, isolated, and immediately surrendered. You exercise power, but only the power to endorse someone else's power. And this strange, neutered form of action is celebrated as democracy's highest achievement. Elections operate on a schedule. This seems obvious until you consider what it means. Political engagement becomes episodic. It has seasons. There are moments when politics is supposed to matter intensely, and long stretches when you're supposed to return to private life and let the people you elected handle things. But power doesn't operate on this schedule. Corporate mergers happen between elections. Surveillance infrastructure expands between elections. Wealth concentrates between elections. Environmental destruction accelerates between elections. By the time you're invited to participate again, the landscape has already changed in ways you never voted on. The electoral cycle creates a rhythm that benefits those who exercise power continuously. They know you're only paying attention periodically. They know they have years between your moments of supposed influence. They can afford to make promises during campaigns and break them during governance because your next opportunity to object is scheduled far in the future. And during that future election, you won't be asked about what happened during the previous term. You'll be asked about new issues, new crises, new reasons why this particular moment is uniquely important. The system has no memory. Each election is framed as a fresh start, which means nothing that happened before can be addressed. You're always voting for the future, never holding anyone accountable for the past. This temporal structure isn't a bug. It's engineered. It ensures that political engagement remains sporadic and that power remains continuous. Your attention is scheduled. Their action is constant. And they call this democracy because you get to show up every few years and register an opinion about which set of people should ignore you next. Here's where the system achieves something truly remarkable. It convinces you that critique itself is dangerous. That examining the insufficiency of voting is a luxury you cannot afford because the stakes are too high, the dangers too immediate, the other side too threatening. Every election becomes the most important election. Every choice becomes existential. And in this permanent state of emergency, you cannot ask whether the choices themselves are adequate. You can only pick the less bad option and hope it's enough. This is the logic of the lesser evil, and it's the most effective mechanism for preventing political transformation ever devised. Because it's not imposed from above. You impose it on yourself. You police your own thinking. You suppress your own critiques. Not because anyone forces you to, but because you've internalized the belief that anything other than enthusiastic participation in inadequate choices is effectively collaboration with worse ones. But look at what this does over time. Each cycle, you vote for something you don't want in order to prevent something you want less. Each cycle, the range of possibility narrows. Each cycle, you're more invested in defending choices you never truly endorsed. And each cycle, you move further from any politics that might actually address the conditions that make every election feel like an emergency. The lesser evil logic doesn't preserve democracy. It slowly strangles it. Because democracy requires the ability to demand more, to refuse insufficient options, to create alternatives. But you've been trained to see such demands as dangerous, such refusals as privileged, such alternatives as fantasy. You've learned to accept less and call it pragmatism. And the people who benefit from this arrangement don't need to suppress your dissent. You suppress it yourself. You become the enforcer of your own limitation. And you do it sincerely, believing you're protecting something precious, never noticing that what you're protecting is the mechanism of its own erosion. There's a word we've stopped using correctly: consent. We think consent means saying yes. But consent, in any meaningful sense, requires the genuine possibility of saying no. If no isn't really an option, if refusal leads to punishment or catastrophe, then yes isn't consent. It's compliance dressed in the language of agreement. Apply this to voting. Can you say no? Can you refuse the options presented without being told you're responsible for disaster? Can you reject the entire framework without being accused of abandoning your civic duty? If you cannot, then your yes doesn't represent consent. It represents the extraction of compliance through the threat of consequences. The system calls this participation because calling it compliance would reveal too much. But watch what happens when someone genuinely doesn't participate. Not because they're apathetic, but because they reject the framework itself. Watch how quickly the rhetoric shifts from celebrating democratic participation to condemning democratic abandonment. This reveals something crucial. The system needs your participation more than you need the system. Your vote legitimizes the entire apparatus. It creates the appearance of public consent for decisions made through processes you have almost no control over. When you vote, you're not just selecting a candidate. You're endorsing the idea that this selection constitutes democracy. You're signing off on the system itself. And here's the trap. If you don't participate, nothing changes. The system continues, now with one less voice that might have made a marginal difference. But if you do participate, you've consented to the framework that ensures nothing fundamental can change. Either way, you lose. But only one way lets you pretend you're winning. They built something ingenious. A system that extracts your endorsement while giving you almost nothing in return. And the extraction doesn't feel like extraction because it's wrapped in a language of empowerment, rights, and freedom. You're told that voting is your voice. But think about what a voice actually is. It speaks whenever it needs to. It can change its mind. It can interrupt. It can refuse. It can create new language when existing language fails. Your actual voice has all these capabilities. Your vote has none of them. Your vote speaks only when permitted in pre-approved language about pre-selected options with effect determined by systems you didn't design. This isn't voice. It's echo. You're permitted to repeat back one of the sounds already in circulation, and this repetition is celebrated as self-expression. But the system needs you to believe its voice. Because if you recognize it as echo, you might start asking where the original sound comes from. You might start wondering who's doing the speaking that you're only permitted to repeat. You might start wanting actual voice, the messy, disruptive, ungovernable kind that doesn't fit into ballot boxes. Democracy, if it means anything, means the people speaking, not echoing, not selecting from pre-approved phrases, actually speaking, creating the language, setting the terms, defining the questions, not just answering them. But this kind of speech is dangerous. It cannot be scheduled. It cannot be contained. It cannot be used to legitimize decisions made elsewhere. So they gave you voting, and they called it voice. And over generations, the difference between the two became invisible. Now when you vote, you feel you've spoken. And that feeling, more than any external suppression, is what keeps you quiet. Here's what every conversation about voting carefully avoids. Democracy and capitalism are incompatible. Not in theory, in practice, in the actual mechanics of how power operates and reproduces itself. Capitalism requires that economic decisions be made by those who own capital. Democracy requires that social decisions be made collectively by those affected. These aren't different approaches to the same thing. They're fundamentally opposed organizing principles. And in every society that claims to be democratic, one principle has clearly won. Economic power determines political possibility. Wealth translates directly into influence. The people who own things have more say than the people who don't, not just in theory, but in every mechanism that matters. Media ownership, campaign funding, lobbying access, policy formation, regulatory capture. You can vote all you want, but if economic power remains concentrated, your vote will only ever determine which manager administers a system organized around someone else's profit. You're selecting supervisors, not determining the conditions of your life. And the brilliance of focusing everything on voting is that it makes this fundamental power structure invisible. You're encouraged to think about candidates, parties, platforms, polls. You're never encouraged to think about the fact that everyone you can vote for accepts the basic architecture of capitalism as non-negotiable. That acceptance isn't their personal failure. It's the admission price to being a viable candidate. The range of debate is constrained not by law, but by economic structure. You can argue about how to regulate capitalism, how to redistribute some of its proceeds, how to mitigate some of its harms. You cannot argue about whether to have it. That question has been removed from democratic consideration. And as long as it remains removed, voting will only ever determine details, never directions. So if voting isn't democracy, what is? This is the question the system trains you never to ask, because the answer is threatening. Democracy, in any form that deserves the name, requires something the current arrangement cannot permit: actual collective power over the conditions of existence. It requires that people can gather and make binding decisions about how their communities function, not advisory decisions that those with real power can ignore. Binding ones. It requires that economic life be subject to democratic determination, not protected from it. It requires that the people who do the work have say over how that work is organized and what happens with what it produces. It requires continuous participation, not episodic. It requires that political engagement be woven into daily life, not contained to scheduled moments. It requires institutions designed for deliberation, not just selection. It requires that disagreement be productive rather than merely theatrical. Most threatening of all, it requires the redistribution of time. You cannot participate meaningfully in collective self-governance if you're working 50 hours a week just to survive. Democracy requires leisure, not as luxury, but as infrastructure. It requires that people have time to think, to meet, to argue, to learn, to change their minds. None of this is impossible. It's simply incompatible with how power currently organizes itself. And voting, rather than challenging that organization, has become its most effective defense. Because as long as people believe voting equals democracy, they won't demand actual democracy. They'll keep pulling levers in a machine designed to ignore them, calling it participation, never noticing that participation without power is just performance. Here's what makes this moment dangerous for those who benefit from confusion. More people are noticing. The gap between the promise and the reality has grown too wide to ignore. You can feel it in the exhaustion, the cynicism that people apologize for but cannot suppress, the sense that something fundamental isn't working, even when you can't quite name what. This noticing is political, not in the sense of choosing sides within existing options, but in the sense of recognizing that the options themselves are insufficient. And once you notice this, you cannot unnotice it. You can suppress it. You can tell yourself to be realistic. You can defer your skepticism until after the next crucial election. But the knowing remains. The system calls this cynicism. It calls it apathy. It calls it disengagement. These are diagnostic errors. What looks like withdrawal is often lucidity. What looks like apathy is often exhaustion from caring about things you cannot change through approved channels. What looks like cynicism is often the healthy recognition that you've been lied to. And here's what the system fears: that this individual recognition might become collective, that people might stop policing each other's insufficient enthusiasm for inadequate choices, that the conversation might shift from how to vote to whether voting, as currently structured, deserves the weight it's been given. This shift doesn't require that you stop voting. You can vote and simultaneously recognize its limits. You can participate in elections while refusing to mistake that participation for democracy. You can pull the lever and still acknowledge you're operating a machine that mostly runs regardless of which lever you pull. What it requires is that you stop defending the substitution, that you stop treating critique of voting as attack on democracy, that you recognize the difference between what you've been given and what you've been told you have. The real question isn't how to vote better. It's how to build power that doesn't depend on permission from those who currently hold it. And that's a completely different project than electoral participation. It looks like workplace organizing that doesn't wait for legislation to establish rights, but creates them through collective action. It looks like mutual aid networks that meet needs the state has abandoned without asking the state's permission. It looks like communities making decisions about their own resources and defending those decisions against external interference. It looks like people gathering not to select representatives, but to practice direct democracy in whatever spaces they can create or claim. It looks like building institutions that operate on different principles than the ones you're offered through official channels. It looks like treating political engagement as something you do continuously, not something you wait for permission to do periodically. None of this is utopian fantasy. People do this now, in the margins, in the spaces power hasn't fully colonized. What's fantasy is believing that voting alone will ever produce the transformation those in power spend billions ensuring it cannot produce. The system knows this. That's why it works so hard to make voting seem like both the floor and ceiling of political possibility. That's why it celebrates voting as civic duty while treating other forms of political action as suspicious, dangerous, or naive. That's why it pours resources into get-out-the-vote campaigns while criminalizing the occupation of abandoned buildings or the disruption of business as usual. Power recognizes what it fears, and it fears collective action that doesn't route itself through systems designed to neutralize it. It fears people who stop asking permission. It fears democracy that doesn't confine itself to ballot boxes. So here's what this all points toward: the recognition that you've been sold a replacement and told it was the real thing. That voting, for all its importance within its limited sphere, is not democracy and was never meant to be. That actual democracy would require transformations the current system cannot survive. You can keep confusing the two. The system prefers it. You can keep investing your political hopes in electoral cycles, keep experiencing the same disappointment, keep telling yourself that next time will be different. Nobody will stop you. In fact, they'll encourage you. Or you can start asking what democracy might actually look like. What would require? What stands in its way? And then, more dangerously, what you might do about it. Not alone, not through individual consumer choices disguised as politics, but collectively, through the messy, difficult, ungovernable work of people deciding together how they want to live and then making it happen. This isn't a call to abandon voting. It's a call to stop letting voting be the answer to every political question, to stop defending its limits as if they were virtues, to stop treating participation in a rigged game as if it were the same as changing the rules. The people who benefit from your confusion about this will tell you that such thinking is dangerous. And they're right. It is dangerous. To them. To arrangements that depend on your participation in the fiction that you already have what you're still fighting for. How long will you confuse voting with democracy? As long as it serves you to do so. As long as the alternative seems too difficult, too risky, too uncertain. But every moment that confusion continues is a moment actual democracy remains impossible. Not because it's impractical, but because you're too busy defending its replacement to demand the real thing.